Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, November 25th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. Happy Thanksgiving to my American listeners and any who celebrate abroad. I am excited about this week's episode. I don't know, it has a little bit of extra special sauce, maybe because I've been not feeling so hot post-election. I've been, kind of struggling to find hope. And there was just a little bit of magic in this show, and I really hope that you all feel the same way. But before we dive into it, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download, and the way we keep it going is by relying on the support of individuals just like you. If you would like to pledge your support for the time being on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. All right, so this week I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Katherine Rundell. She has a new book out. But before I tell you about that, you should know that she is a fellow of St. Catherine's College, Oxford, and she has written a bunch of different novels for children that have won a ton of awards. They've been translated into a bunch of languages. She sold more than 2 million copies worldwide, and she's written for a bunch of other outlets. I said a bunch a lot there. She's written for many other outlets as well. But her new book is called Vanishing Treasures, a bestiary of extraordinary endangered creatures. So without any further ado, I hope that you feel the same kind of magic that I did in speaking with Dr. Katherine Rundell. Well, Katherine, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So I'm excited to talk about your new book, Vanishing Treasures, the bestiary. Is it a bestiary? Is that how you pronounce that? Of extraordinary endangered creatures?
Exactly that.
So before we even get into what a bestiary is, I would love to talk first about sort of your background, what you do with your time, and how this book came to be. So tell us a little bit about sort of your title.
So I am a fellow of St. Catherine's College, Oxford. I did my PhD on Renaissance literature, in fact, on the Renaissance poet John Donne. And then I also spend a lot of my time writing children's fiction. I have a book called Impossible Creatures, which just came out in America. And then I would say Vanishing Treasures is the project that belongs to my heart and soul and bones, in that it is a bid to write about the natural world and about endangerment and climate change in a way that you can also give to your uncle who isn't completely on board with that. I wanted it to be, in some ways, it's 23 essays about animals, and some of it is science, but a huge amount of it is history and myth and a sense of the way that we have interacted with, understood, misunderstood these creatures. But I wanted it to be a little bit funny and a little bit sharp, and to sort of Trojan horse my way in to people's attention, to say, will you look at these wonders? Will you look at what we still do not know? And would you agree to astonishment? And if you would agree to astonishment, would you then agree to fight? Because we have never needed to fight more, ever, than now.
Oh, and so how did you choose, I was going to say who, what, who or what, to highlight in the book?
So it was such a process of winnowing. I have many, many half-written accounts of of the living world. But so it would often be that there was a remarkable story. I usually pick a creature where there is something that you will have latched onto your imagination. So, for instance, I write about hermit crabs because it was probably a hermit crab who ate Amelia Earhart. And I write about seals because there was once a seal who learned to speak sentences of English in a very, very strong Boston accent. And then the criteria for inclusion was, are a species or subspecies of this animal endangered? And as you can imagine, in the world we stand on now, that narrows it down almost not at all. Almost everything has a subspecies which is endangered, even things you wouldn't expect, like crows and pigeons and spiders. There are still things whose future on the planet is uncertain.
Yeah. Yeah. And so tell us, I guess I don't even know where to start with this because there's so much here, right? But maybe we can pick a story and we can start with a story and then move on from there. So obviously you had to winnow down all of these beautiful stories, but was there one or maybe a small group of them that inspired the whole book? Was there a story you wanted to tell that then you were able to build off of?
Yes, absolutely. So the book began with the pangolin. And in fact, some of these essays were originally in the London Review of Books. Most of them I wrote for the book. But the first one I wrote years ago, I think in 2018, when I spent part of my childhood in Zimbabwe because my father worked in international aid. And I had gone back to visit family, and while I was there, I was taken to see a pangolin. And when I got home, I told my friends about this as one of the most beautiful things that I have ever seen with my eyes in my life. And the vast majority of them didn't know what it was. And I thought, right, well, there is so little I can do about the many, many sorrows of the world, but I can force people to know what a pangolin is. And so I wrote this essay about the idea of a pangolin. And of course, it makes perfect sense that we wouldn't know about them because, our education is fairly lacking in the way that we talk about the natural world in schools and universities, socially. But a pangolin is a scaly anteater. And it looks like if you had coated an anteater in a sort of grey-green scale. And they have remarkably beautiful, generous faces. They look like a very polite and thoughtful academic. And they are, one of the great miracles of the world.
Oh, and they are deeply, deeply trafficked. Aren't they the most trafficked animal on the planet?
The most trafficked animal on the planet, exactly that. So they have a very strong defense against predators, which is that they roll themselves into a ball, and that's where name comes from the Malay word penggolong, which means roller. But of course, for us, that means that what they have done is render themselves immediately and easily portable. So they have no defenses against us. And, across the world, particularly in China, they are eaten as a delicacy, and their scales are sold as forms of medicine. And so their future on the planet looks increasingly like, if we have this conversation in 50 years, there may be no more. And that would seem to me a stupidity that we couldn't expect to be forgiven for, because they are so beautiful. They are so deeply part of many cultures. So in Zimbabwean culture, parents tell their children that alluvial gold, the gold you find in the earth, is actually pangolin droppings, and that pangolin droppings are pure gold.
Ugh, I love that. I have to ask you, I mean, you have this way of speaking. Obviously, you have a way of writing, but the way of speaking and way of writing really are deeply connected, which isn't always the case when I interview writers. What do you think? Is this just your personality? Is it just your core? Or do you think that this was deeply informed by your kind of academic training in historical literature?
That's such a good question. I think it's my personality. I think it's. I think I've always been like this. I think so much of it is I had a very distinctive childhood. I was in a landscape where you could be outside with your friends without parental supervision in the wild so often. So a huge amount of my childhood was spent outside, just roaming, watching the natural world. You could just sit and watch a grasshopper or a snake or a monkey or a bird. And then when I wasn't that, I was reading and I was obsessed with books. And I had this sense that books were a kind of food to me. I think if you had said at the time, what do you love doing? It wouldn't have occurred to me to say, I love reading. In the same way, it wouldn't have occurred to me to say, I love eating. It was just absolutely part of my landscape. And I just read all the books that I could find. I read my way through the children's library, which wasn't big, and then I read my way through the adults' library after that.
And do you think that contributed to your interest in writing fiction for children?
I think so, yes. I think one of the things about writing for children is it requires the discipline of total clarity, because you cannot obfuscate or self-congratulate or elongate for children. They will just stop reading. And so I think I had this sense of this is a gift. This form of discipline will impose on work when it's good. I mean, there's a lot of terrible children's writing, of course, but great children's writing is great in part because of the discipline that the child reader imposes on the work to get to the point, to make it sharp and vivid and bold and worth reading. I think that is probably very much part of the reason that I write for, those sort of 8 to 14 age bracket.
But don't we need that too as adults? Does that translate into your work for adults?
I hope so. I get asked this so much. I think it's such a fascinating thing. How different are they? How different is it writing a big imagined adventure mythical story for a 12-year-old and writing in some places, quite complicated account of the way you might decipher the age of a Greenland shark for adults? And I would say they're the same. I think you have the same duties. The discipline of, is it true? Is it accurate? Is it morally true? Is it factually true? The discipline of, is it vivid? You are so busy. We are all so busy. The world is full of so many calls upon our time. No writer has a right to your time. So it has to be worth your time. Your time is fleeting and the greatest thing you can offer me. So it has to be worth it. And then finally, and I guess it's the most ruthless discipline, does it matter? So the pieces I write about animals, they're short. They tend to be between 1,000 and 2,000 words, but of course they start off much longer and they get shorter and shorter. I think the discipline of compactness is one that really makes you think, if someone's only going to remember 3 things in this chapter, what do you want it to be?
Mm. And is that really your process? Is that you produce a lot and then cull?
Yes, for this nonfiction work. In the same way that I wrote a biography of John Donne, the Renaissance poet who was the subject of my doctoral thesis, and what I used to teach at Oxford. And with that, it was vastly longer. It was, at its worst, I think it was maybe 3 times the length of the final book. And then your job is to say, it is not fair to put the duty of winnowing and sorting onto a reader who might never have heard of John Donne. If you have spent a decade reading about John Donne, it is your duty to say, actually, you know what? They don't need to know exactly how much it cost to mend this full set of bells in the church that he was working in 1614. That's my job, not yours. And I think sometimes I get exasperated with books where it feels like they haven't quite done enough of the winnowing, not done enough of the decision making. I want writers to know what matters and to offer it to me.
And how does the writer decide? That's really a lot of power. That really is the power, right? In being the one who produces the words on the page. But what is that process like? And do you think it's different for every single writer?
I think it is different for every writer. And of course, I think it is deeply informed by the way that the information economy now works. I think that if I had been writing Vanishing Treasures in the year 1880, I would have included everything I knew about every creature, because you would have had very few other accesses to information about the pangolin. But you right now, within half an hour, could discover hundreds of facts about the pangolin, perhaps not the slightly more out of the way ones in the book, but certainly like the basics very quickly. So for that reason, I am never trying to be exhaustive. Instead, what I want to be is selective. I want to tell you, these are the things that the scientists think you should know. And these are the things that the old myths would tell you. And this is the best anecdote I've ever heard about this creature. And, then my dream would be you might read the book and you might fall wildly in love with the narwhal. And then you might go and read a monograph about narwhals, or even 2 or 3, until you felt that the narwhal was deeply your ally. But the thing is, one of the things you discover, these pieces, they take me a couple of months each. And so you do end up knowing a lot. And the moment you know, I would say, 1,000 words worth of knowledge about an animal, you feel it differently when you see it. The minute you know 5 truths about the crow or 5 truths about the wombat, when you see them, you feel that they are yours to protect. You feel more of a duty towards them. You feel they are more alive for you. The metabolation to metabolize knowledge into love. I think the time that takes is tight. I think you can do that in a single essay, if you make it sharp enough.
When you wrote these essays, did you write them sort of piecemeal? Did you write them for other outlets first and then combine them? Or was the point always to include them in the book?
The point always was to include them in the book. And I don't know how long it was, many months, I guess, half a year or so, when I was writing just these pieces. I have this huge stroke of luck, which is that because I belong to Oxford University, a lot of my colleagues are scientists. So if you want to double check something about the narwhal horn or the precise makeup of a giraffe's leg movement, then you can find a giraffe scientist. And that was one of the great joys. But yes, they were quite a concerted timescale for me, rather than doing, one here or there. But as I say, I did also write them. I wrote a few a year for the LRB for a few years.
Mm-hmm. How did the process of researching and then writing, or researching and simultaneously writing these individual stories, how did it change your relationship to these animals and to the natural world?
I think I had always been aware that wilderness and living things have a complexity and profound forms of knowing that we do not have yet the makeup to understand. I always knew that, but it has been borne in upon me so profoundly. I mean, if you speak to scientists of the living world, the thing they will want to tell you over and over, they'll tell you within 10 minutes of meeting them, the thing they want you to know is that we know a huge amount about the living world, about spiders and frogs and trees and earth. But what we know, in comparison to what there is to know, is barely touching the tiniest edge of the beginning of the truth. And so when I went about writing these pieces, I would first read some monographs, watch some documentaries, speak to some scientists. But I was always aware that there is a great deal we do not know. And I think that's what really was born into me while I was writing these pieces. It's the thing that changed me. That when we look at the natural world, we do not know the depths of its nuance, the depths of the precision, the astonishing movements of evolution that have led us to these creatures. Things like we don't know how birds know where to fly when they migrate. We don't really know. We think it's probably to do with the gravitational pull of the Earth's core, but we don't know. And I think that is something worth bearing in mind. We must not destroy this staggeringly beautiful, staggeringly strange, extraordinary thing that is the living world before we have a chance even to begin to understand it.
As I sit here and I listen to the passion in your voice, I can't help but feel that classic experience that I so often work through with my patients, which is this deep feeling of ambivalence, this deep bittersweet feeling, this awe and wonder butting up against a darkness and a depression and a sadness at I don't want to say the potential for loss, but we're in it right now. We are actively losing these organisms. And I'm wondering how you sit in that place where darkness and light sort of meet, and how do you write from that place, or do you write from the light?
It's such a good question, and one you must face every day. I think often of Antonio Gramsci, who I'm sure you know was imprisoned under fascist Mussolini, and he wrote letters from jail, and he said this famous thing, which I'm sure all your listeners will have heard, which is, I am a pessimist because of intellect, but an optimist because of will. I think there are many, many reasons to despair. And I think sometimes it can feel like your despair is itself a kind of prophylactic against disaster, a kind of praxis. But your despair and misery and sorrow are not helpful. And so I try as much as possible to remind myself that despair does not in itself change anything. And, it is too important to despair. It is too important to lose hope. And so there are, of course, days, we have just lived through some of them, where the only reasonable option looks like horror and dread, or like its very close cousin, which is throwing up your hands and saying, well, climate change is certainly now going all the way, so we might as well just eat and drink and be merry because it's over. But it's not over. And the time to give up is never. And so I tell myself when I'm writing, my despair can go into the bits in the book where it talks about what we have done in terms of climate change, in terms of habitat loss. But my despair is not good meat. It will nourish nobody. And so mostly what I want to do is offer this fact that hope is also a truth. Faith is also a truth, and action requires those things. It requires some element of faith that it might work. So my hope is active these days. I'm not sure I feel it in my chest so much as I feel it in my feet and hands.
Oh, I love it. And to clarify for those listening, because we're recording this in real time, it's going to air not in real time. We're recording this on Friday, November 8th, only like 3 days after the American presidential election, when I think that there is a collective sense of despair and a collective sense of throwing up our hands. And I think what I appreciate so deeply from you right now, Katherine, is that one of the things that has been frustrating for me when I talk to friends and family members and when I see things on social media is the sort of saccharine Pollyanna response, which feels so thin and inauthentic. But I do not have any doubt in my mind that this hope of which you speak is it's not manufactured, and it's not like a tincture that you're describing, but it's there in spite of the despair.
Exactly that. It lives alongside. And the thing is, I think in the new world that we live in, after this election, I think I am willing to accept that I will live with dread in the pit of my stomach, because that is based on fact. And I think I'll probably live with it now forever. To be honest, I had it before the election. But in some ways that doesn't matter. What matters is what I do, and what matters is what we all do. And so I feel like I get asked a lot how, I feel terrible anxiety, or my child feels terrible anxiety. What can I do about that climate anxiety? Is there a book you can offer? And of course, I would love you to read this book, and I hope it has hope in it. But really, the finest way to calm the rising tide of horror that will oversweep your body is to act. If you happen to be lucky enough to have money, give it away. If you happen to have money that is invested, go tomorrow and make sure that no jot of it is invested in fossil fuels. Protest, get involved in politics, eat less or no meat, vow to fly infinitely less. And at that point, your horror will still be there, but at least there will be within yourself a light that battles it. You know, the way Martin Luther King, I always forget the actual quote, but he says something like, "The right temporarily defeated is still greater than evil triumphant." And so, I just think find ways to keep fighting. And sometimes the way to keep fighting is just to begin fighting.
Absolutely. I mean, I think right now in this moment, I'm a bit overcome with some emotion. I had 2 podcasts scheduled this morning here. I'm here in Los Angeles, so it's just become afternoon, and my truck actually is packed. My bags are packed, and as soon as we finish this hour, I'm driving to like a remote place outside of the city so that I can spend the night in nature. And it's the only thing I can do right now. It's the only thing I can think to do with the way that I feel. I don't think I'm ready to fight. I think I'm quite tired of fighting and I need to rest. But I think that part of that process is being with the very world that we're fighting for.
Exactly that. And of course, the thing we forget is that the things we do are contagious. So if you go out into the natural world and you find ways to make that work, and you tell your friends and your friends tell their friends, one of the things we need is to make more people remember or know if they never knew. Because I think one thing we must never forget is how deeply embedded in privilege access to the natural world is. I think if we can just make it something more and more and more, the way that we experience peace, leisure, hope, I think that it does shift the way a human stands on the earth. We need to be reminded often we're a very, very forgetful species. We need to be reminded often that we too are nature. We too are animals. And the idea that we would not spend some of our time in the living world, no wonder so many of us feel alienated and lost. We cannot cut ourselves off from nature without feeling the pain of it. And I think you are so wise to put yourself back under large skies.
How often did you do that very thing as you were writing about these creatures? How often did you find yourself in their presence, whether in a protected way, like, through, and we can talk about, we don't have to talk on this show, but we could talk offline about the complex ethical parameters around like zoos, for example, or just, having the opportunity to actually encounter them in a natural setting?
So I have been very lucky. I spend a lot of my time in the countryside in England. I live in London. but I spend quite a lot of time when I can for weeks or months at a time in Norfolk. And in Norfolk, there are seals, and you would never go near them. They do not need your attention or your sticky hands. They don't need my little enthusiastic presence. But I swim a lot in the sea. If someone would say, what's your very favorite thing in the world, I would say swimming in the sea. And sometimes they just come to you. Sometimes the seals will come curiously, just to check out what you are and what you're doing. And that is a truly remarkable feeling. And then when I'm in London, I live near a park, and there you do see wild things. It just takes time and patience to see them. And then there are things which I expect never to see. So I think I will never see a narwhal, because I think to put myself in a position to see a narwhal would probably be quite harmful to the narwhal. So there are things where I am content that my love would be damaging to them. So what I'll do is I will read instead and watch, the stunning wildlife footage that professionals have made and salute them from afar.
It's such a brilliant kind of meditation on the role of humanity, which we are animals, and we have our own relationship to the planet, and yet we constantly grapple with such a firm appreciation that it becomes an extractive practice. It's such a difficult thing, because I think when we truly look at the roots of this sort of colonial, disastrous extraction of our planet, it comes from a place of a deep hunger for experience.
Exactly that. What do you do about the fact that we long to see that which is beautiful? And because, we as animals long to be alongside other animals. And the person who longs to go to the Maldives to see the giant turtles longs to do it out of hunger for knowledge of them up close. I know people who have never cried in their lives, in their adult lives, who says the first time that he ever cried was when he saw an ancient turtle. And it's a very difficult balancing act. How do we balance our desire for knowledge and our profound love of these creatures with the knowledge that the technologies we built to get us there are themselves damaging? And I think it's something that we all have to hold in the balance constantly. I have a friend who flies a lot, but eats no food that has flown to her. And that is her compromise, which means she eats, a heck of a lot of potatoes and kale. And that's the decision that she's made in order to allow herself to fly. And I think it's something that we should all, I don't know the answer, but I do feel it's a question that we should keep asking, and not allow people who would roll their eyes and, say that it is precious or pointless, or what difference is one person going to make? Because, there's that amazing moment in that film, Adam's Rib. It's got Katherine Hepburn in it. It's one of my favorite films. It's in many ways insane. But it has this brilliant moment where she's quizzing her secretary, and she says, they're talking about infidelity. And she says, what if a man cheats on a woman? And the girl says, well, not nice. And she says, well, what if a woman cheats on a man? And the secretary says, the worst. And Katherine Hepburn says, why the difference? And the girl says, I don't know, I don't make the rules. And Katherine Hepburn says, sure you do. We all do. And I think of that often. Cultural standards are built by all of us. And so I think that is why it is worth continuing asking those questions.
Oh, I think that's it's such an interesting meditation on an idea that sort of draws from existentialist philosophy that I often bring up with my with my patients, but also here on the podcast. I actually have it tattooed on my foot.
Oh, wow. What do you have tattooed on your foot?
I have tattooed existence precedes essence, and not the other way around. And I mean, I think that this applies deeply for the human experience, that we often like to ascribe essentialist explanations for behavior when those explanations are much more likely constructs.
Yeah, much more likely than we are willing to imagine or fathom. And it is one of the great difficulties, bound up, of course, with its partner difficulty. How then do you change those constructs? And it's the question that we will have to ask now in a newly, profoundly inhospitable place to that question. How do we change how we have imagined joy, glamour, luxury, leisure time? How do we change those to make them as glorious, as fit for delight and glee and passion, but less wildly destructive? And of course, the wildly destructive habits we have, they're only 100, 200 years old. They're new. And the reimagining is necessary. It will come either by volition or by force. But it is one of those eternal questions. How do we shift a whole nation's or a whole world's or a small community's imaginings?
And really, when does that shift begin, I think is an important question. As a psychologist, I think about our cognitive development, and I think about identity development, and this process by which we discover that we are volitional creatures and that we are change makers. And I think it comes sooner for some, much later for others, and never at all for a certain percentage of people, that we're not automatons and we're not destined to carry on whatever torch our mothers and fathers handed us.
Yeah, right. Exactly that. And of course, that is so bound up with the question of, is change possible? As you say, the torch, we could put down the entire torch. We could light a whole new avenue of lights. But it is very difficult to remember it, and it is very difficult to do. And inertia and structural change are real things, but it is something that I think about children a lot, because my job is in part writing for them. And I do think it is possible to teach children profound things and to help them remember them. And so I do think it is possible within a few generations to change attitudes to the living world. But it requires many, many of us to fight and to remember that we are the many.
What is that relationship then that you see between awe and wonder and action?
So my reckoning would be, what is awe and wonder? I think they have been, powerfully co-opted by the industry that makes posters of sunsets with cursive handwriting on them. When people say awe or wonder, I know that often what they are picturing is somebody telling you to live in the moment or relish every day's beauty. Yes, of course, but also something far, far, far greater. And I think of the ways that we've thought about astonishment and wonder over the centuries. And I think of it increasingly as an active thing. I think that your wonder requires something of you. I would say this: we owe the world our wonder because it is self-evidently wonderful. It is self-evidently so full of things of a complexity and beauty that passes our understanding. Of course we owe it our wonder. But you cannot remain in a position of wonder at something you already know. We know this. You can love something, but you can't remain astonished by the familiar. That's very difficult to do. But what you can do is you can decide to learn until your deathbed. You can decide that the way you remain astonished is by learning the things to be astonished by. Whether that is learning about the natural world, about physics, about, the astonishing chemistry of the ocean. And you can learn and learn and learn, and you will not come to the end of your learning before your death. There is so much to know, and time is short. And so I think of that as the stepping stone. And then I think if you truly come to be deeply enmeshed of knowledge of the world, then action becomes necessary. And I don't want to sound naive, because I know it is very possible to love an elephant and then shoot it in the face. We know this. People have done this throughout history. But I do think that if we want action, what will drive it? I think rage and fury and fear, I think those are all helpful. But I don't think that they can be sustained by the human body. And so I think we will need something else. And I think it will have to be a kind of iron-willed, furious, loving astonishment.
You mentioned that awe and wonder had to be an active process, that this kind of furious astonishment is ongoing. And one of the ways to feed that is through the hunger for more knowledge. And I actually do see a parallel between awe and wonder and love. And I'm from I'm of a tradition similar to what Eric Fromm wrote about, that love is not I guess, a feeling, but it is a behavior and it's a choice. Just like empathy is not something that you're born with. It's not something that some people just have and some don't. It's a practice. You have to do it. And the more that you do it, the better you get at it. And I think that I would argue that love and empathy and awe, they all require regular engagement to foster and grow.
Absolutely. And of course, so many philosophers have thought about, Iris Murdoch, the idea that love and attention are so closely bound up as to be almost the same thing. And I think love and attention, astonishment, wonder, learning, they are all very close to being not synonyms, but collocates. They belong in the same family of practices. And I think often people think sitting and having hope is enough as an emotion. And I think that is, as you say, these things, they are an active practice, a practice intellectually, spiritually, and politically, physically.
And so is the starting point, well, I shouldn't call it the starting point, but is an early point of that process then engaging with stories, engaging with not just information, but deeply affecting information like that you provide in your book? Is that one of the big goals of, engaging in such an exhausting practice, is to share your own passion in the hope that it may, I don't know, infect might be not quite the right word, maybe with a more positive valence than that, but to catch on, with others?
Exactly that. And I'm very aware, I know that books are a niche sport, and I know the limits of the form, but I do think there is this one huge truth. We are story-eating animals. We hunger for stories, and that can be a political story of the type that can conquer America, but there are stories that can lodge themselves in our brains. And so it's why, I just really, really want people to know that, in 1827, a giraffe walked through the streets of Paris, down the Champs-Élysées, and ate rose petals from the hands of the King of France. And I want people to know that, like, what happened was France went insane and people started dressing like giraffes and wallpapering their houses with giraffes. And, the colors of the day were, tears of the giraffe and giraffe in love. And women would make hairstyles to look like the two horns, the ossicones of the giraffe, but their hairstyles would become so sort of vibrantly vertical rather, that they wouldn't be able to sit in their carriages because it would bump against the ceiling, so they'd have to sit on the floor of their carriages. Like this idea of, this absolute wild enamoring. And it seems to me that's the reasonable response. To see a giraffe and go a little unhinged, that seems sensible to me. and I think I could tell you lovely facts about the giraffe, but you'd forget all of them. But you might not forget the idea of a giraffe in a couture Paris-made fleur-de-lis embroidered raincoat. Walking through the streets and looking for peace. And so I think that is for me why I want to tell these snippets, these flashes of history, in the hope that they might get under people's skin. And then, all the money from the book goes to my money anyway. The royalties goes to climate change charities, because as of the election result, I wanted the book to be a little part in the fight. So, the idea that stories might generate money, which might generate a tiny drop in the ocean of the need in this fight.
Oh, that's incredible. And, I was kind of resisting asking a question when you were sharing that fabulous story about the giraffe. But now I feel like I must, because I think that this is a perfect segue into it. You have chosen to take the fruits of your labor and put them in a place where they can do good. The person in Paris who was observing this bizarre and charismatic creature walking down the street, one person chooses to emulate that creature in the fashion of the day. Another person chooses to engage with nature in a deeply sort of reverent and preserving way. And yet another person chooses to conquer that animal and say, we must get more. We must put them in the zoos. We must kill one so I can display it in, my sitting room. And so the awe and the wonder, I guess there's a responsibility even to that with what do we do with that awe and wonder?
I mean, that's so very true, that one of the ways that people have chosen to love giraffes is to shoot them and then make a cushion of their heads, complete with the eyelashes still attached, or get a Bible cover in giraffe skin, or a cover for your shotgun case in giraffe skin. So I think we have to be wary of thinking of passionate interest as an unadulterated and obvious good. Of course it's not. Of course you can adore giraffes and therefore want to fill your house with dead ones. And so I guess at that point you start thinking about ethics, about the idea that your wonder, if you have a duty to it, your duty is the duty of the ethics of the living world. And we know what those ethics are. That those ethics are: use as little as you can, take notes from every other living ecosystem that is not ours, and note how to live in symbiosis and not to exhaust your resources in the way that, the West has done.
Yeah, and perhaps a meta ethic here, a lesson that I feel like I'm kind of learning in real time, is that we shouldn't ignore or minimize the very love that leads sometimes to these deeply destructive and misguided behaviors in sort of producing or providing pressure to reduce those kinds of behaviors. We should highlight the very love that preceded them and find a new outlet for that love and that awe.
Exactly. And of course, that is so much of it is bound up with our acquisitiveness, because I could find you a giraffe's head cushion that looked very like a true giraffe's head, but that was made by a remarkable artisan whose skill with material is such that you can have that cushion as a way to signal your adoration. But I think we also have to factor in the fact that our acquisitiveness has some element of power. You know, the idea of the Medicis who would fill a square with wild beasts and then let them free so that they could be hunted. And part of the lure of those creatures was that they were rare. You know, why do people want tiger skins? Yes, because they're beautiful, but also because they are endangered. And the book touches on this a little bit. The idea of, it's a truly bleak idea, of extinction hoarding. In the chapter about tuna fish, the idea that because wild, non-farmed bluefin tuna, particularly a few years ago, were critically endangered, there were companies, Mitsubishi among them, who were buying up great stocks of these tuna. And I should say that they deny this, but many conservationists believe that what they were doing is, in keeping it stored at very, very low temperatures, waiting for extinction to come. Because at that point, these corpses become infinitely more valuable. And we know this happens with, for instance, rhino horn. We know that there are poachers out there who are employed to shoot. Many conservationists cut a rhino's horn off so that they won't be poached for their horn. But there are poachers who are being paid to shoot rhinos without marketable horns, just in order to bring about the final death quicker. It's a form of vile humanity known as extinction gambling. And I think when we think about things like extinction, I think we need to factor that into our understanding of mankind. You know, I believe in our staggering capacity for change and for unbelievable efforts to do good, to protect, to nurture, to nourish. But I think it is better that we do not forget that other flip side.
And, you know, I think that here, as we're sort of coming to the end of this conversation, and we are entering into this sort of grappling with some of these darker questions, it's also important, at least, and maybe this is simply my perspective because I am not a religious person at all, and I don't believe in the sort of simple categorizations of good and evil and, you know, light and dark nature, but that many of these very vile practices that are sort of unequivocally terrible, they don't come from a place of evil, but they come from a place of desperation. Of, you know, greed is often built out of insecurity, and that certain practices may not have to exist if certain people were able to exist comfortably on this planet. And I can't help but see an interplay there between how we treat the most vulnerable among ourselves and how we treat these vulnerable creatures.
Absolutely. And I think that is wholly right, as you say, both at a profound psychological level and also just in the most basic practical terms. I love wild things. And I love the great parliament of the non-human. But I think, I also think we owe such love and care to those peoples whose livelihoods have been most eroded. So, for instance, if you want to stop people poaching the most endangered lemurs in Madagascar, engage in child nutrition. Engage with the poorest, because it is only because there are so few other ways for people to feed their children that those lemurs are being poached. And so I think, when we talk about need, I know there are people who would like to separate the needs of the animal world and the needs of the human world. Perhaps people who understandably are exhausted by humanity, but we are so bound up with each other. And, humanity is itself a great and shining thing. One of the things the book points out is that, the process of respiration casts out photons, which are the elementary particle of light. So the human body is itself a shining thing. We are constantly emitting light, mostly from around the face. We are, for all our horrors, we are remarkable, miraculous animals.
Ugh, what a stunning and profound button to put on this beautiful conversation at a time when uh, I really needed to have this conversation. And I really want to thank you for sharing your wisdom, your poetry, your insights, and your passion with us here on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real delight. And I hope your night under large stars is a very fine one.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. The book is Vanishing Treasures, a bestiary of extraordinary endangered creatures by Dr. Katherine Bundle. Katherine, thank you so much for being here. And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.